Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers about their work, the publishing industry, and how they do what they do. This show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms. And you can subscribe either here on YouTube or on one of those platforms or on both, so you never miss a thing. That, of course, would be my preference, but you do you. We're going to come back to that later anyway, and I'm going to hit you with the whole pitch about, please leave a review and help other people find it. So I'll come back to that though, because I really want to get to talking with my guest, who today he's an award-winning author and a journalist, Mark Pawlosky, whose career as a reporter and a media executive has taken him all over the world. These days, he's a full-time author and the man behind a really cool new thriller series, the Nik Byron thriller series, which debuted in 2022. That book, that debut book, entitled Hack, introduces us to Byron, who is an ambitious investigative reporter trying to come back from a bad career setback, who gets involved in a story where he's trying to suss out the theft of some very sensitive technology sought after by terrorist interests. I'm reading it right now, and I got to tell you, it is really, really good. Really, really enjoying it. The second in the series, Friendly Fire, came out this spring, and there are more Nik Byron books due to be out either the end of next year or early next year, end of this year, I should say, or early next year. So a lot more in the queue as well. Mark, welcome to the open mic. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Rich. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's get right into it. I'm a reporter myself, so of course I'm always interested in your backstory and how you got here, but we'll get to that. Let's start with the Nik Byron books, which I mentioned, of course. Tell us about the series.
Yeah, so there are, I'm working on the fifth book in this series right now, called Rendezvous. There are four completed. You mentioned two, Hack and Friendly Fire. The next book, it likely to come out late this year, early next year, called Blackbird. And really the first book in the series is called Newshound, which is the media company that Nik works for. It was written, and it's all the other books I'm doing are set in Washington, D.C. This one was set in the Midwest, Newshound was. And after having pretty long conversations with my publisher and my editor, we came to the decision to hold Newshound and use it as a prequel. So after we run out the four books, we'll probably then go back and introduce how Nik's career started and how he ended up in Washington, D.C. And the series itself follows Nik Byron, as you mentioned, is the reporter, and his colleagues, by and large, Mia and Mo and Frank Rath, as they move from the Midwest into Washington, D.C. And Nik has a number of career challenges and setbacks as he goes through following these stories and reporting on these stories, but he leans on his colleagues heavily. So that's kind of it.
Well, I'm interested, of course, always in how authors develop characters, and especially reporters, because origin stories come from a lot of places. Is Nik Byron based on anyone that you knew in the business? As I noted, you were a reporter for a very long time. I mean, how much of Nik is you? How much of he's somebody else? Or is he pulled out a whole cloth? Tell me a little bit about how you developed that character.
He's an amalgamation. There is a good piece of my DNA in Nik, his name is sort of an homage to a reporter that who used to work for me at one time, who's now no longer with us, named Chris Byron. And Chris worked for the New York Observer and did this column Through the Keyhole. And he was if you got a call from Chris Byron, you're going to have a miserable week. He did great investigative work, especially on Wall Street, and scam artists. And Chris was a reporter and a columnist for me when I was at MSNBC, and so I kind of hijacked a little bit of Chris and Nik as well. And it's there are a lot of you come across a lot of interesting characters when you're in journalism, and a lot of interesting reporters. They they're not none of them that I've known are really cut from a mold, and you had a wide variety of personalities, and I try to weave those, the strong personalities into my characters that I knew, and that I've come up with.
Well, I find it interesting too, because there's a pretty big difference between print reporters, TV reporters, even radio reporters, just because of the formats, you come at things a little differently, timing, like how fast something is going to get up. If you're writing for a magazine, that's so different than if you're writing for a daily or whatever. Did you ever think about, well, maybe for an immediacy point of view, I would make him a TV guy instead of a print guy? I mean, what kind of considerations went into that when you were thinking about story structure and how you could present those stories to the audience?
So oddly enough, I helped start MSNBC on the internet side, and worked pretty extensively with our broadcast partners at NBC. So the newsroom at MSNBC was a collection of print, young online, digital natives, radio. We had guys from who worked for AP on the radio side. We had wire service guys. We had local television, and we had folks that came from the national television broadcast side. So I had the benefit of being able to see how all these people worked in a real newsroom environment that was supposed to be all about immediacy. And what I took away from that is that the television, what the television people and the radio people brought to it was a sense of logistics and moving very quickly on a story.
Mm-hmm.
And however, what they didn't possess was the ability to really create a narrative of a story in the same way that writers do. And so so I just kind of lean more on my own background, even though I did have worked alongside broadcast and did internet. That just the way stories are structured, and the way I think about structuring stories, and the way I was even brought up to think and talk is in sentences and paragraphs and active verbs. It just felt more comfortable to me to go with someone who came up like Nik through newspaper work and writing and long form journalism versus the broadcast. Though the broadcast people did teach me a lot about quickly moving and logistics. So some of that comes to fore, and characters that play off Nik in the story. There are broadcast characters that are some of his arch competitors and rivals, and maybe even enemies.
Yeah, that's one of the things maybe the average person who's not in media doesn't know, is how how deep that rivalry can be between not just print reporters for different publications, but between radio and TV. I've seen in scrums around politics, things get pretty heated between reporters, right? Because the TV guy wants to have the best visual shot. The print reporter wants to be able to be up front. They'll get his question answered or her question answered without this, TV guy cutting in. And, especially in politics, they all want to be on TV, right? So we always feel like they're cutting us out, and just so I love those kinds of interactions when you have a reporter as a character, because they're very, very real to me, right? Certainly.
Right. And the print people, I mean, there's a certain piousness about, or used to be about print people anyway, and a smugness. And that kind of blows up in Nick's face a few times too, because it happens in the real world. I mean, there are great reporters on all platforms.
Well, and I love several things about Nik that I wanted to talk about, but you just one I didn't really have on my agenda, but it comes to mind, of course, is there is a smugness a lot of times about. I worked in DC for a little while too, and I can remember being at the White House. And first of all, I was 20 years older than all these other reporters, which is just the thing now. They're children; they're so young.
Right.
Seems like, I mean, literally, they're younger than my own daughter, and it's just crazy. But listening to them talk was really kind of hilarious because it was all about who they knew and whose cell phone number they had and all this stuff. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm so beyond any of that stuff as a professional these days. I don't care. Right. But it does drive a little. I mean, I think if you're going to accurately write about reporters, you have to have the fact that a lot of times there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of ambition, and sometimes, they're not always fully formed humans. Uh,
Right.
but they're trying, they're doing the best stuff that they can. And so, you know I've noticed in a lot of the reviews they note how Nik is a flawed. That's I see the word flawed a lot, and that can mean
Uh-huh.
a lot of things. you know I'm very sure that was intentional. So when you are putting those together, tell me a little bit about creating a flawed character like that, and how flawed can that person be and still be likable.
Well, one of the things with Nik that sort of holds him back is that Nick's not in about building brand. And you're talking about the young reporters. I think that is so key to their profession now, is what is their brand, right? And yeah, if you work for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, that still carries a lot of weight. But even within those environments, the reporters are trying to still, build their brand, and that is something that Nik just desperately fights against. And so he's never comfortable in that situation. And when he's pushed into that, he sort of has these, I won't call them meltdowns, but he definitely goes sideways, and he gets his dander up, and he does things that are not good for his career, and that often derail his career. So, and then so that's part of the flawedness, but there's also the personal side to Nik's flaws. He like the young reporters that you were mentioning, Nik puts the story in front of almost every personal relationship he has, and it's not intentional. It's like he can't help himself, and
Mm-hmm.
so his first marriage, goes asunder because his wife is works for the Attorney General's office, the U.S. Attorney General's, and they're constantly butting heads about sourcings, and Nik trying to look over her shoulder and seeing what she's working on, and she's trying to figure out what Nik is working on, but it's in his DNA to pursue the story even when it's not in his own best interest. And so that causes a lot of problems for Nik, and leads to his character flaws, and he makes bad decisions along the way. Though hopefully he usually catches himself before he goes right off the cliff, but on
Right.
a few occasions he doesn't.
Well, one of the things I really like about him is that what he does as a professional is pretty plausible. How he goes about his work is plausible. And by that, I mean a lot of stories, both movies and especially in movies, but certainly even in books, I've seen, the reporters do things that no halfway intelligent real world reporter would ever do or be allowed to do, because it would get you fired or get you, barred from whatever it is you're covering. Um, do you ever find yourself following a thread of a story and then pulling back and saying, hold up, Nik just cannot do that. It's not remotely realistic that he would do that.
Um, so more so, it's the plot of the story that I sort of, in the same way that you're talking about, it's like, would this really happen if a reporter was how authentic is this? Both what Nik is doing, but also what the story that he's investigating. And is that something that I know has happened, could happen, or is in the realm of possibility? And so if the plot gets out into those far edges, then it almost tells me, and then I'm not sure that that's a good plot or a bad plot, but then I have Nik pursuing that, and I'm like, no, that just doesn't seem plausible. It doesn't seem plausible that for a reporter to be doing that, and for a reporter to be really, you would look at that as a reporter and say that that there is neither a story there, or that it's just too hard to believe. And so I try not to get Nik in those situations where he's following just crazy threads, and that helps me keep him more honest to the reporting. And I really do. I mean, things that the way Nik goes about looking at a story and collecting his information, and how he distributes that information, and how he builds out his story, is pretty much what I knew, or what I saw other reporters do as well.
Well, along those lines, tell me a little bit about your research process, because I'm always interested in how, when writers can take very realistic situations and find one thread, maybe, or one aspect of it that they can then fictionalize to the hilt and keep a reader interested or tied to it because it is so realistic. And for me, that comes from research. A good friend of our show, Jonathan Mayberry, talks about how he writes suspense and dark fantasy, but he keeps this list of experts in various scientific and medical fields, and he talks to them all the time, because he says, look, if 9 things in my plotting or whatever are real, the science is real, these are things that are happening right now, I can do anything with the 10th one, right? And that's what makes the fictionalized part of it so interesting, because it's so based in reality. And I think about it too, whether politics or crime, whatever it is, the story is. So what is your research process like? Do you find yourself still saying, well, okay, I'm a reporter, I know how to research a story, let me suss all of this out and then figure out where I can put the fictionalized parts? Or is it different? What does that process look like for you?
So it's sort of a mixed bag, honestly. I am a voracious, as you probably are as well, consumer of news, across multiple platforms. I still get the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal delivered to my home daily, and I scour them, as I do news sites. But it's also drawn from my own experience, like in Hack, with the opening scene of the 2 guys leaving Washington, D.C. after having blown up this research facilities. I covered I covered the Oklahoma City bombers, and not only did I cover them, oddly as it may sound, they grew up in the same part of the country I did, in northern Michigan. Literally, they lived 15 miles from where I grew up, and worked for the same, at one point, worked for the same agriculture, the farmer that I worked for as a teenager. And so I always imagine those guys so I was in the Dallas bureau of the Wall Street Journal when that happened, and I always imagine what those guys talked about and what their reaction to when they were going to and coming from Oklahoma City. And so the opening scene of Hack is kind of based on what I knew and what my reporting was of those people, and both as people that grew up in a rural area, as well as what my reporting and what I found out later, just following the story. So that's kind of percolated in my mind forever about those two guys. And I didn't intend to, when I sat down to write that book, to have them in there, but it just sort of evolved that way. And then in the Friendly Fire, a lot of the research I did on artificial intelligence and weaponry is, I dug deep into the Pentagon paper, white papers out of the Pentagon, committees that were formed to oversee how AI should be ethically advanced and used in military. The committee minutes, the people who are on the committees. I then took that knowledge and kind of spun it forward, building this, which is called Bullwhip, this massive military armada, which did not exist, but now, after the book has been out, it looks like that's exactly the way the AI is going in military, and that it is going to be fought with machine on machine versus what we generally think of as traditional warfare. But I spent a lot of time researching AI and researching, how the military was, not only our military, but the Chinese and Russian military as well.
Yeah, it really does come through when you read fiction. You can tell when a reporter or a writer, I should say, has done that kind of work. And I find it really also helps with pacing.
Uh-huh.
All the reviews that I have read of both of the books, Friendly Fire and Hack, overwhelmingly they all talk about pacing and the fast pace and in a very positive way. And I totally agree. I have read a lot of books of late, mostly written by former TV people who write in these shorter paragraphs and very fast paced way. And I'm hoping it is becoming the go-to trend, as opposed to oh god, now the author just went out of my head. The guy that wrote all of the suspense thrillers forever, that Jack Ryan series and all that stuff.
Oh yeah. Not Stanford, but yeah. I've read all of this.
No, but that there was an era there where the chapters were long and there was
Right.
super intense amount of information, and you felt like in some ways you were reading a textbook. I love this style where it's faster paced, it keeps moving, and the twists keep coming, and it makes it hard to put the book down. And that I've been feeling that about Hack. It's just I've really been rolling through it that way. And I'm just curious for you, how much of that in your writing style is the reporter muscle coming through, where you do have to write, every sentence has got to count, right? You got to really move things forward. You don't often get a lot of time to spend on laborious detail. And how much of it is something that was conscious when you said, well, I'm going to write the book and I want the book to be like this? How much was something that you had to change in your process or in your style?
Well, like Nik, and this is where Nik and I are similar. I find writing to be very hard. It's not. I have good friends who are writers who literally can belch and they can produce 4,000 words. I'm not one of those guys. I labor. But that was one thing at the Wall Street Journal. I mean, they were really insistent that every word, every sentence, every paragraph has got to move the story forward. And if it's not, cut it, get it out of there. And so it's writing, and I would say it's 60% writing, 40% editing, and sometimes the reverse of that. And I spend way too much time going over what I've written, and it's my ear that I'm really, I'm reading out loud to myself and say, does this sound right? Does this sound, authentic? Does it sound genuine? Does it sound like how people would talk in that situation? And if it doesn't, I labor over making it sound right, or I get rid of it.
I really hope anyone listening to this that's an aspiring writer picked up on what you just said about reading your stuff out loud. It
Yeah.
really, really is an effective tool for getting rid of clunky words, because if it sounds clunky when you read it, it reads clunky.
Yeah.
You really do need to be aggressive with your own editing, much less before it gets to your editor. You really do. Um, on your website, a somewhat chance encounter with a friend that inspired you to start writing fiction. And I thought it was a really fascinating story. You told it very quickly. Do you mind sharing that with us here now?
Sure. His name is Rob Angel. And we are our sons were friends, and they were in the same kind of scout group together. That wasn't a scout group, it was an outdoor group that when I was living in the Pacific Northwest, and we do these fall weekends out out on one of the islands, and sort of, not survivalist, but we do like life and death in the forest with these big groups of kids. And Rob was in the same group that I was in, and got to know him over the years. We both lived on this island in the middle of Lake Washington. It was very small, and everybody kind of knew one another. And he, I ran into Rob when he was coming out of a dry cleaner, and he stopped me and told me that he was working on an autobiography, and he was in the beginning stages of it, and asked me, because he knew I was a journalist. He said, have I ever written a book, a novel? And I said, no, I had not, but I had, written long form pieces, magazine pieces. And I said, you write a 20,000 word magazine piece, you do 3 or 4 of those, you got yourself a book. So I said, I think I know the structure. I know how pacing should go. I know what goes into the background research. And so we sort of informally agreed that I would help him on his project. And so this went on over a couple months. We talked on the phone, we got together, we kicked around ideas. Eventually Rob decided to go with a ghostwriter out of New York City, which I didn't fault him. But I did feel a little let down that, my vision of me being an author was sort of vanishing in front of my eyes. And then it wasn't long after that I thought, well, because I had been working for a company as the head of some parts of their digital media operation, and they were on the East Coast and I was on the West Coast. And they wanted me to relocate to the East Coast. I didn't want to do that. So I stayed in the Seattle area, and started going back and doing some freelance writing, editing, consulting. And then I thought, what if I just stopped doing that and tried to write myself? And that was the beginning. I sat down, and several months later, I guess probably 7-8 months later, I had my first novel. And Rob went on to publish his called Game Changer, and he's the creator of Pictionary. So it's it was no small autobiography, and it was it was one of the, if not at the time, the largest selling board game in North America, if not parts of the world. So
Wow.
there you go.
Wow. Well, I'm sure there's probably even more to the story than that. And I want to ask you about that, because it really does feel like this probably went pretty fast. I mean, I don't remember what year. I think you said that was 2018.
Yep, 2018.
So 5 years ago, only 5 years ago, and now you're on your 5th book. And traditional, good agent, good publisher. That's pretty fast for most writers. Now, I'm going to credit that wholeheartedly to the quality of your work and professionalism. But did you ever, in this process, say, I should have done this years ago?
No, because I couldn't have done it years ago. I tried to do it years ago. Probably in the 2000s, I took a sabbatical from where I was working and went, got a cabin on the Oregon coast and sat down to write, and nothing came of it. I mean, really. So it would have been great had I done it years ago, because now instead of being on my fifth book, I might be on my, God knows how many. But it was meant to happen in the time it was meant to happen. And I have thought about that, but I don't think I was where I needed to be, either as a journalist, writer, someone who could really kind of think through that longer sort of form back then. And I know people who were able to do that. I had other mountains to climb before I got to writing novels.
Well, and, you've noted as well that, and so many of the writers I've talked to have gone through this, where, the pandemic just seemed to change everything. Now, for some folks, it was a good thing, others not. Tell me a little bit about how the pandemic played into this process for you, because you were just getting started, really. And then, we had about a 3-year hiccup in the whole process. And I remember I did a series of these interviews with writers talking about how they were trying to maintain their creativity in this time when it felt like everything was falling apart. And so tell me a little bit about it, because you said there were other elements of society at that time. There's, big protests and social justice movements that were part of it. Tell me a little bit about keeping the creativity and the momentum going during that time.
Well, so on the plus side of that, I mean, there was nothing else you could really do, right? I mean, things were shutting down. There wasn't a lot of social activity. There wasn't going out. So that was a real factor in me just kind of strapping myself in every day and doing 1,000 words and writing from, generally I write from 11 to 5. And that's how that started. It started in that late morning into the afternoon. And so that was great. On the not so great side is that, my first novel came out, and it got a good, Newshound got a good reception. We got up into editorial committees. And the editor came back to my agent and said, we like this, but he's a debut author. It could just be a flash in the pan. But we would like to see another book before we decide what to do. So that's when I started working on Hack, and finished Hack. And my agent sent Hack out, and it arrived at the publishers literally on the day that the publishing industry shut down because of the pandemic. And it was just, I mean, the timing was terrible. And a lot of the contacts my agent had in the publishing world, they just disappeared. The people were getting laid off. They were, they didn't know what their careers were going to be. They weren't returning calls. And it went into a hiatus. It went, into a black hole there for a while. And so the only thing I knew to do was, okay, I'm gonna keep on writing. And so I started working on Friendly Fire. And so we did that. And so I mean, for me, it had both good and bad elements to it. And all things being equal, I wish the pandemic had not happened for society reasons, but also for my own selfish reasons. Things may have turned out different on the publishing side. And it wasn't, and so in sort of within that was, once the publishing world started coming back, social justice issues were at the forefront. And a lot of the books that were being considered, or a lot of the books that were not being considered, either were dealing with that or not dealing with it. And it was clear that publishers were gravitating toward those topics and those themes. And I say more power to them. And to the writers who rode that wave. But for the writers who were not riding that wave, I mean, things changed 180 overnight, and so you had to, you just had to deal with that. That was sort of the hand that you got.
A good friend of mine down in Southern California writes mystery, mostly police procedural novels, and he's fabulous. He's been on many bestsellers lists. Yeah, he's really struggled with the new book because it's based in the 1970s, and any author will tell you when they write a book that's based in a different time frame, there's challenges you don't even think about. One of the ones he's run into is he's from Wisconsin, so also the upper Midwest, and he's talked about how the editors that he's worked with have given him a lot of flack for some of the very non-PC things that some of these characters say. And his thing is, look, I was there in 1970 in this place in Wisconsin. I know that's not how anyone speaks today, but the book is set in 1970. This is how people talked in 1970. And it's been a real challenge for him and for them, right, to find some middle ground, because there really is. And I'm with you. Look, all power to him. Look, I agree. There's a lot of things we were saying in 1970 that were stupid and we shouldn't be saying. But at the same time, if you're writing a book set in that time frame, you can't have them talking like it's 2023. So it hasn't been fully resolved for him yet, and that's just one example. I'm sure millions out there, or hundreds, whatever. But it's a tough one. There's so many things in the publishing industry that go beyond the quality of the words that you're writing and your sentence structure, right?
Right. And honestly, it is, when you talked about the young reporters, I mean, that is the same in the publishing industry. You have a lot of young people who have either positions that are influential or are next to influential people, and they view the world differently. And I think that, like all of us, we have certain biases. I think the young people looking at authors that who come from a different generation have their biases as well. So I think there are a lot of different roadblocks that didn't exist before, and you can bemoan all that you want, but that's just kind of the way that things have evolved. And publishers and editors are, I think, a lot more sensitive and to social sort of blowback, and they're unwilling to fight those battles like they may have been in the past.
Absolutely. Really quick, yeah, you've worked all over the world. Will we ever see a Nik Byron novel set in Tokyo or London or Munich or one of the places that you have
So I have traveled all over the world for work, but I haven't lived all over the world necessarily. The Rendezvous, the first chapter in Rendezvous, it opens in Vienna. So and it's one of my favorite openings, though I love the Blackbird opening too. But yeah, this one is set in Vienna, and it doesn't linger in Vienna. It does have several chapters in Vienna and that part of Europe and Germany, but then it comes back to the States.
Well, personally, I like the DC setting a lot because, if you've ever lived in DC, you know what a great setting. It's like a character unto itself. And as I'm reading, I'm going, oh, I know that place, that kind of a thing. But I love DC as a setting. I mean, it's such a world city, Really quick, what's your creative process like in regard to going from that blank screen to being able to type the end? Is there what's the driver for you? Is there one that's a real driver for you to get something finished?
So, yeah, to get something finished is a sort of a lifelong ambition of mine. If I pick up a book and I start reading it, even if I hate it, it kills me not to finish it. So that's the same with my writing projects. And I started out writing the first novel was all longhand on yellow tablet. And the second one started that way too. And eventually it got less and less so. And then Blackbird, I think, was mostly I outlined it and then I went from the outline into just working on the computer. Rendezvous. I've signed up for George Saunders online class. It's not a class really. He teaches literature and writing at Syracuse, and he's considered one of the foremost American writers, I guess, now at this time. And in one of his postings and dialogues back and forth with his students, he was talking about not having a plan to write, and that having a plan kind of straitjackets you in some ways, and so the creative process isn't allowed to really develop the way it probably should. So I took that to heart with Rendezvous, and it's nearly killing me. I mean, not because I said, okay, I can do this. I can wing this. I sort of have a framework. I know how it starts. I think I know how it's going to end. But I'm that big middle part. I'm going to embrace George Saunders, and it may be one of the. So I think, in some sense, he's right because I write short stories as well, but they are literary. They're not thrillers. They're not in the genre. And in the short story writing that I do, it's more like that, and I get that part of it. I think in doing the more of the suspense and thrillers that I do, it's a little bit more tricky if you're just going to wing it. At least that's proving true for me.
Yeah, I
So
think
we'll
so.
see.
I can certainly understand that because especially if there's a political aspect to it, plot. I mean, for me as a reader, nothing trumps character, but the plot is hard. Plotting is hard. I don't know any other way to say it. Plotting is friggin' hard, man. In my own writing, I mean, I love writing characters. I love writing dialogue. There's so many things like that. But God, my dogs have been the beneficiary so much of my stuff because when I get stuck, they get a long walk, right? Because I
Yeah,
need to suss things out in my head. So they were sitting around waiting for me to get some writer's block, right? So because plotting is hard, and I finally broke down too and said, okay, I can't do one of these 100-page outlines that some people I know do, but I can do enough that I know at least, okay, where am I supposed to be in the story, right? I mean, I can still figure out how I want to get there, but I need to be here,
right,
if I'm going to get to here, right? This
right.
hasn't happened. No.
Well,
Uh,
and in this case, I have three intersecting plots, and I need to be a trapeze artist to pull this off. I think I can do it, but we'll see.
um, I've only got two more here for you. This one should be quick. What's the best advice you ever got as a writer, and maybe conversely, what's the worst?
Ah, you know, I mean, it's cliche, but it's writing is rewriting, honestly. And just when you put it down on paper or put it on your screen, you think it's perfect, and you come back the next day and you realize, well, it could be better. And then you come back again and the next day, it still could be better. It still could be. So I'm a huge believer in that. And it probably chews up more time than it should, but I live by that model. And the worst advice I got, I think George Saunders' advice, just let it fly.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really love hearing about all of this, and like I say, I'm bombing through Hack, and I have to read a lot of books, as you might imagine, for this.
Uh-huh.
And I usually have 8 or 9, literally, I'm not kidding, going on at a time. So I don't ever get to finish anything nearly as fast as I like. But well, I love when I get one that I can't put down, and so I've really been enjoying Hack quite a bit. So I'm
Wonderful.
going to encourage everybody to go out and buy it. And then, of course, I will be getting a copy soon of Deadly Fire too, or excuse me, Friendly Fire.
Right.
Let me end on a fun question, which again, I hope it's a fun question. I mean for it to be a fun question. Let us say I had the magical power. I could put you together with one of the following 3 people. Who would you choose and why? The options I'm going to give you are the filmmaker D.W. Griffith, the great newsman Walter Cronkite, or the very famous detective Alan Pinkerton. I can put you together with one of those 3. Who would you choose and why?
I would take door number 1. And for the simple reason that I am in discussions about with producers about taking an option on the books to develop, and so I need to learn a lot more about the film side, and I'm in the throes of that right now. So
there you go. Good, logical
yeah,
answer, which is what you would expect from somebody who is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, right?
there you
Good,
go.
logical business, savvy decision. I'm going to
Yep.
do the thing that I really need to do right now. Mark Pawlosky, thank you so much for joining me here on the open mic. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And like I say, I encourage everybody, if you haven't discovered Mark's work, please check it out. You will not regret it. It's really, really good stuff. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thank you, Rich. I had a great time.
Good. Well, I warned you all that I was going to come back to my little bit of self-advertising, which is, please, if you would be so kind, whatever what podcatcher, I guess, you're on, or even on YouTube, leave a comment, leave a review, hopefully a good one. It really does help people find the show, though. And if you're interested in writing, or people who are interested in writing, you're really not going to find a more affordable way, certainly, or more interesting way to learn about how people who are really good at this are doing what they do. So help folks out, help them find the show, help them get connected to some of the great guests we've had here today, like Mark, who's been very generous with his time and with his insights into the publishing industry and his work. So thank you again, Mark. I will leave you with the final thing that I always leave us with, which is tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. Until then, for myself, Rich Eisen, and my guest, Mark Pawlosky, this has been The Open Mic.